Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly, or perhaps it was something else, a recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty. And even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance, with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who'd been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that 2 of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and their interpretation was a specialised skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The chief cupbearer went first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. "This is what it means," he said gently. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace, but first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row, he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them, they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time, Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, He was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offense. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials. But now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph. the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. You intended to harm me, he would later tell them, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing. This is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of Sacred Slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specialises in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow. Hello dear listener and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whether it was filled with joy or challenges, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling down for the evening, or perhaps finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day? Wherever you are listening from, know that you are part of our global community of souls, seeking peace and spiritual connection. If this is your first time joining us, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. We're here to bring you stories that nourish the spirit and calm the mind. Tonight, we journey to ancient Judah, to a time when God called a young man named Jeremiah to carry a message of both warning and hope. This is a story about divine calling, about being reshaped by loving hands, and about finding purpose even in the midst of struggle. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us begin. In the 13th year of King Josiah's reign over the kingdom of Judah, when the morning mist still clung to the hills of Anathoth, a young man named Jeremiah sat beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. The leaves whispered secrets in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in that whisper something stirred within his heart. Something he couldn't yet name, but could feel as surely as the warm earth beneath his feet. Jeremiah was not like the other young men of his village. While they spoke boldly of their plans and dreams, he preferred the quiet company of his thoughts. While they gathered in the marketplace to debate and jest, he found himself drawn to solitary places where he could listen to the deeper rhythms of life. His father, Hilkiah, was a priest, and perhaps that was why Jeremiah felt such a natural pull toward the sacred, toward the spaces where heaven seemed to touch earth. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed higher and cast dancing shadows through the olive branches, Jeremiah felt that familiar stirring grow stronger. It was as if someone were calling his name from a great distance, though he heard no voice with his ears. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, knowing you were meant to step in but uncertain of your ability to swim. Then, as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into his ear, came the words that would change everything. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah's heart raced. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but he was alone with only the olive tree and the endless blue sky as witnesses. The voice came again, gentle yet unmistakable. Jeremiah, I have called you to be my messenger. The young man's immediate response was one of panic. Sovereign Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. I don't know how to speak. I am too young. Who would listen to me? I am nobody special, just a priest's son from a small village. Surely you have made a mistake. But the presence that surrounded him was filled with such love and certainty that his fears began to quiet. Do not say you are too young, came the gentle correction. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. In that moment, Jeremiah felt something touch his lips. Not a physical touch, but something deeper, more real than anything he had ever experienced. I have put my words in your mouth, the voice continued. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. As the presence gradually faded, leaving only the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling, the distant lowing of cattle, Jeremiah remained sitting beneath the olive tree, stunned by what had just occurred. His life had been ordinary just moments before, and now he was being called to something extraordinary. The weight of it should have crushed him, but instead he felt a strange peace settling over his spirit. He didn't yet understand what lay ahead, couldn't foresee the years of rejection and persecution that awaited him, or the deep wells of sorrow he would have to draw from. He only knew that the God of his fathers had spoken to him, had chosen him for a purpose that was both terrible and wonderful. And though he trembled at the thought of it, something deep within him whispered back, Yes, Lord, I will go. Months passed after Jeremiah's calling, and he found himself struggling with the enormity of his task. The messages that came to him were not easy ones. Words of warning about the spiritual condition of Judah, prophecies of coming judgment if the people didn't turn back to their God. How could he, a young man with no credentials or authority, stand before the elders and priests and kings with such heavy words. One morning, as Jeremiah prayed in the quiet of his chamber, seeking guidance for this impossible mission, he heard the familiar voice of the Lord speaking to him once again. "Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message." Jeremiah had passed by the potter's house countless times in his life, but had never paid it much attention. It was a humble building on the outskirts of the village, marked by the constant sound of the spinning wheel and the earthy smell of wet clay. As he approached that day, however, he felt a sense of anticipation, as if he were about to witness something profound. The potter was an elderly man named Malachi, whose hands bore the calluses and clay stains of decades spent at his craft. His hair was white as wool, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent his life creating beauty from formless earth. When Jeremiah arrived, Malachi looked up from his wheel and smiled, as if he'd been expecting him. "Shalom, young prophet," Malachi said, his voice warm with genuine kindness. "Please sit and watch. I have work to do." Jeremiah settled himself on a wooden stool in the corner of the workshop, fascinated despite himself. He had never really watched a potter at work before, had never paid attention to the intricate process of creation that happened in this simple space. The wheel began to turn, and Malachi placed a lump of clay in the centre, his hands moving with practiced precision. At first the clay seemed to resist, wobbling and threatening to collapse, but Malachi's hands were steady and sure, applying just the right amount of pressure, guiding the clay upward into the beginning of what would become a vessel. Jeremiah watched in wonder as the formless lump slowly took shape, a wide base, curving sides, the promise of something beautiful and functional. But then something went wrong. Perhaps there was a stone in the clay, or a dry patch that wouldn't bend. The emerging vessel began to collapse, its sides caving in despite the potter's careful ministrations. Jeremiah expected to see frustration on Malachi's face, perhaps anger at the ruined work. Instead, the old man simply smiled and pressed the clay back into a lump, ready to begin again. "The clay has its own nature," Malachi explained, his hands already starting to reshape the material. "Sometimes it has hard spots, or air bubbles, or impurities that make it difficult to work with. But clay is forgiving. It can always be reformed, reshaped, made into something new." As Jeremiah watched, the potter began again, this time working the clay more thoroughly, removing the impurities that had caused the first attempt to fail. Slowly, patiently, lovingly, a new vessel began to emerge, different from the first but no less beautiful. In fact, this second creation seemed to have a character all its own, shaped by the very challenges that had destroyed its predecessor. It was then that Jeremiah heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him, as clear as if someone were standing beside him. "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand." The words hit Jeremiah like a revelation. He understood now why he had been sent to this place, why he needed to witness this simple yet profound act of creation. The people of Judah were like clay in God's hands, sometimes stubborn, sometimes marred by the impurities of sin and rebellion. But God was not a harsh taskmaster who would discard them when they failed to take shape properly. He was like Malachi, patient and loving, willing to reshape them again and again until they became the vessels he had always intended them to be. "The message I want you to carry," the Lord continued, "is not just one of judgment, but of hope. Yes, I must sometimes tear down what is corrupt and broken, but I tear down in order to build up again, in order to create something better and more beautiful than before." Jeremiah felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the potter's hands continue their gentle work. Here was a picture of God's character that he had never fully grasped before. Not the angry judge he had sometimes imagined, but the patient artist who sees potential in every lump of clay, who never gives up on his creation, who can bring beauty from the most unlikely materials. "Thank you," he whispered to Malachi as he prepared to leave. The old potter looked up from his work and smiled. "The clay thanks the potter by yielding to his hands," Malachi replied. "Perhaps that is all any of us can do, yield to the hands that know how to shape us into something beautiful." As Jeremiah walked home through the narrow streets of his village, he felt a new understanding of his calling beginning to take root in his heart. He was not just a bearer of bad news, but a messenger of hope. The God who had called him was not a destroyer but a creator, not a tyrant but a loving craftsman who would never abandon his work. The words came to him then, the message he would carry to the people of Judah. "If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it." It was a message of both warning and promise, of judgment and mercy intertwined. Like the potter's hands, God's discipline was always aimed at restoration, always working toward the creation of something more beautiful than before. Armed with this new understanding, Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry in earnest. But if he had hoped that his message of God's love and patience would be readily received, he was quickly disillusioned. The people of Judah, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful priest, seemed determined to resist the very hands that were trying to reshape them. His first major public appearance came during the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, who had turned away from his father's reforms and allowed idolatry to flourish once again throughout the land. Jeremiah stood in the temple courts, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard as he delivered the message God had given him. "This is what the Lord says," he proclaimed, his young voice growing stronger with each word. "Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.' If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place in the land I gave your ancestors for ever and ever." The reaction was immediate and hostile. The priests, who had grown comfortable with their compromises and political alliances, saw Jeremiah's words as a direct threat to their authority. The wealthy merchants and nobles who had prospered by exploiting the poor and forming partnerships with pagan nations heard his call for justice as an attack on their way of life. "Who does this young man think he is?" they muttered among themselves. "He speaks of judgment and destruction like some kind of doomsday prophet. Where is his authority? Where are his credentials?" But Jeremiah continued, his heart breaking even as he spoke the words God had given him. He could see the spiritual adultery that had infected his beloved nation, the way they had turned from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and given them this promised land. They had made alliances with foreign powers, adopted their gods, and forgotten the covenant that had made them a people set apart. "My people have committed two sins," he declared, his voice now thick with emotion. "They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." The imagery was powerful and heartbreaking. Jeremiah could see it so clearly. A nation that had access to the purest, most life-giving water imaginable, yet had chosen instead to dig broken wells that left them thirsty and desperate. They had exchanged their glory for worthless idols, their security for political alliances that would ultimately fail them. As the weeks and months passed, Jeremiah's message remained consistent, but the opposition grew fiercer. He was mocked in the streets, his words dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Children threw stones at him, and adults crossed to the other side of the road to avoid his presence. The loneliness was crushing, but what hurt most was seeing the people he loved rushing toward destruction, their ears closed to the voice of the one who wanted to save them. One particularly dark day, after being physically threatened by a group of priests who wanted to silence him permanently, Jeremiah found himself wondering if he had misunderstood his calling. Perhaps God hadn't really spoken to him at all. Perhaps he was just a deluded young man with an overactive imagination and a tendency toward melancholy. But then he remembered the potter's house, the gentle hands shaping and reshaping the clay, and he understood something profound about the nature of love. True love doesn't just tell people what they want to hear, it tells them what they need to hear, even when that truth is painful. The potter sometimes had to apply pressure to the clay, had to work out the impurities and air bubbles, and this process wasn't always comfortable for the clay, but it was necessary for the clay to become what it was meant to be. "I am not their enemy," Jeremiah whispered to himself as he walked through the quiet streets late one evening. "I am their friend. I am speaking these hard words because I love them, because God loves them, because we can't bear to see them destroy themselves." The revelation gave him strength to continue, even as the opposition intensified. He began to write down his prophecies, creating a record of God's words that could be preserved even if his voice was silenced. He wrote of the coming judgment, but also of the hope that lay beyond it, the promise of a new covenant, a time when God would write his law on their hearts rather than on tablets of stone. "The days are coming," he wrote, his hand moving quickly across the parchment, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Even in the midst of his loneliness and rejection, Jeremiah held on to this vision of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The process might be painful, but the end result would be worth it all. There came a time when the weight of his calling became almost too much for Jeremiah to bear. The constant rejection, the threats, the loneliness of being God's messenger to a people who didn't want to hear from God. It all pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had been faithful to his calling for years now, and what did he have to show for it? A nation that seemed more rebellious than ever, leaders who actively opposed him, and a heart that felt like it might break from the strain. The breaking point came when Pashur, the priest who was chief officer in the temple, had Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks overnight for prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The humiliation was complete, displayed like a common criminal in front of the very people he was trying to save. When he was released the next morning, bruised and aching, Jeremiah's first instinct was to flee. He made his way to his favourite spot of solitude, a small grove of trees outside the city where he often went to pray. There, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature, he poured out his heart to God in words that were both complaint and lament. "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived," he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. "You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." The words felt almost blasphemous as they left his lips, but they were honest words, torn from the depths of his soul. He had given everything to this calling. His youth, his dreams of a normal life, his relationships with family and friends. And for what? To be treated as a pariah, a madman, a troublemaker. In that moment of deepest despair, Jeremiah made a decision that felt like the only sane choice left to him. He would be silent. No more prophecies, no more warnings, no more attempts to turn the hearts of a stubborn people back to their God. He would find a quiet corner of the world and live out his days in peace, letting others worry about the spiritual condition of the nation. The resolve felt good at first, like setting down a burden that had been crushing him. For several days, he said nothing about the visions that continued to come to him, ignored the urgings in his spirit to speak out against the injustices he witnessed. He tried to live like a normal person, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures and everyday concerns. But something strange began to happen. The more he tried to suppress the words God had given him, the more they seemed to burn within him. It was as if a fire had been kindled in his bones, a flame that grew hotter the more he tried to smother it. The visions wouldn't stop coming. The burden for his people wouldn't lift, and the words of God seemed to be blazing inside him like a furnace. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, he found himself whispering, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. The realization came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He couldn't stop being a prophet any more than he could stop being human. This wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. God had formed him in the womb for this purpose, had written this calling into the very fabric of his being. To deny it would be to deny himself, to attempt to live as someone he was never meant to be. But more than that, he began to understand that his struggles and sufferings were not signs that he had failed in his calling, but evidence that he was fulfilling it exactly as God intended. The potter sometimes had to apply intense heat to the clay to make it strong and durable. The fire in his bones wasn't a punishment. It was the very thing that qualified him to speak for God. "The Lord is with me like a mighty warrior," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonour will never be forgotten." The change in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of seeing his sufferings as evidence of God's abandonment, Jeremiah began to understand them as proof of God's presence. The fire in his bones wasn't consuming him. It was refining him, purifying him, making him into the kind of vessel that could carry God's words to a broken world. He thought again of the potter's house, of the way Malachi had worked the clay with such patience and skill. Sometimes the potter had to put the vessel into the fire to make it strong, to burn away the impurities and set the shape permanently. The heat wasn't cruelty, it was love, a kind of love that was willing to do whatever it took to create something beautiful and lasting. "I will speak," Jeremiah said aloud, his voice carrying across the quiet grove. "I will speak because I must, because the words are like fire in my bones, because God has made me a prophet to the nations. I will speak not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. I will speak not because people want to hear, but because they need to hear. I will speak because the potter is still at work and I am his instrument." The fire in his bones had become not a burden, but a gift, not a curse, but a blessing. It was the very thing that enabled him to continue when everything else told him to quit, the divine energy that sustained him through rejection and persecution. He was not just a messenger, he was a burning message, a living embodiment of God's passionate love for his people. The years passed, and Jeremiah's prophecies began to unfold with heartbreaking accuracy. The Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem just as God had warned through his prophet. The city that had been called the joy of the whole earth was now surrounded by enemy forces, its people trapped within walls that had once seemed impregnable. During the siege, Jeremiah found himself in an impossible position. His prophecies of judgment were being fulfilled before everyone's eyes, but instead of vindicating him, this only increased the hostility toward him. The leaders of Jerusalem accused him of being a traitor, of collaborating with the enemy by undermining morale with his gloomy predictions. "You're deserting to the Babylonians," they shouted when he tried to leave the city on a simple errand. They arrested him, beat him, and threw him into a dungeon where he remained for many days, forgotten and alone. But even in that dark place the word of the Lord continued to come to him, and strangely it was not a word of judgment, but of hope. "Call to me and I will answer you," came the familiar voice in the darkness. "I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." The message that came to him there in the dungeon was one of the most beautiful and hopeful prophecies he had ever received. It spoke of a time when the city would be rebuilt, when the people would return from exile, when joy and celebration would once again fill the streets of Jerusalem. It was a promise of restoration so complete and wonderful that it seemed almost too good to be true. I will bring health and healing to it, God promised. I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity, and will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me, and will forgive all their sins of rebellion against me. Then this city will bring me renown, joy, praise and honour before all nations on earth that hear of all the good things I do for it. Even as the sounds of warfare grew louder outside his prison walls, Jeremiah held on to these words of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the broken clay of human hearts and human history. When the city finally fell, it was as devastating as Jeremiah had predicted. The temple was destroyed, the walls torn down, the leaders killed or carried away into exile. The sight of Jerusalem in ruins was almost more than the prophet could bear. This was the city where God had chosen to dwell, the place where his people had worshipped for centuries. Now it lay in smoking rubble, its streets filled with the debris of a civilization that had forgotten its God. In the aftermath of the destruction, Jeremiah sat among the ruins and wept. The tears came not from a heart that said, "I told you so," but from one that was genuinely broken for the suffering of his people. He had warned them, yes, but he had never wanted to see them destroyed. He had hoped until the very end that they would turn back to God and avoid this terrible fate. It was then that he began to write what would become known as the Book of Lamentations, a collection of funeral songs for a dead city, poems of grief and mourning that captured the full depth of the tragedy that had befallen Jerusalem. But even in the midst of this profound sorrow, hope refused to be extinguished. "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed," he wrote, his hand trembling as he formed the words, "for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own understanding, as if the Spirit of God was using his human grief to express a divine truth that transcended the immediate circumstances. Yes, Jerusalem had fallen. Yes, the people were scattered and the temple destroyed. But God's love had not failed. His faithfulness had not ended. His compassions were indeed new every morning, even in the darkest of times. "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him," he continued, "to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." As he wrote these words, Jeremiah began to understand something profound about the nature of hope. It wasn't based on circumstances or on the absence of suffering. True hope was rooted in the character of God himself, in his unchanging love and faithfulness. The potter might allow the clay to be broken, but he would never abandon it. He might permit the vessel to be shattered, but only so that he could create something even more beautiful from the pieces. "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever," he wrote, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." The ruins of Jerusalem became, in a strange way, a place of worship for Jeremiah. There among the broken stones and scattered debris, he found a closeness to God that he had never experienced before. The external symbols of faith were gone, but faith itself remained. The building had been destroyed, but the builder continued his work. People would come to him there, survivors of the siege who were struggling to make sense of what had happened. They would ask him why God had allowed such suffering, why the innocent had to pay for the sins of the guilty, why the city of God had been given over to pagan armies. "I cannot answer all your questions," Jeremiah would tell them gently, "but I can tell you what I have learned in my years of walking with the Lord. He is like a potter who shapes clay, and sometimes the shaping process is painful. But he never works without purpose, and he never abandons what he has begun. The vessel may be broken, but the potter's hands are still at work creating something new from the pieces." In the final years of his life, Jeremiah found himself in Egypt, carried there against his will by a group of Jewish refugees who feared remaining in the land of Judah. It was not where he had expected to end his days. far from the city he had loved and served for so many years. But even in this foreign land, he continued to speak the words God gave him, continued to comfort and challenge the people who had been scattered by the winds of history. As he sat one evening by the banks of the Nile watching the sunset over the ancient land of the Pharaohs, Jeremiah reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this place. He was no longer the young man who had trembled beneath the olive tree at his first calling. His hair was now white, his hands marked by years of writing and rewriting God's words, his heart scarred by decades of rejection and persecution. But he was not bitter. Somehow, through all the pain and struggle, he had learned to see his life as part of a larger tapestry that God was weaving through history. He was just one thread in that tapestry, but he had been woven in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right purpose. A young Jewish woman approached him as he sat by the water, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and pain he had seen in so many faces over the years. "Prophet," she said softly, "my heart is broken. I have lost everything. My home, my family, my future. How can I believe that God still cares about me?" Jeremiah smiled and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice warm with the wisdom of long experience. "Once God sent me to a potter's house to watch him work. The potter was shaping a vessel on his wheel, but something went wrong. The clay became marred, misshapen, useless for its intended purpose." The young woman leaned forward, intrigued despite her sorrow. "I expected the potter to throw the clay away," Jeremiah continued. "After all, it was ruined, wasn't it? But instead, he gathered it up and began again. He worked the clay, removed the impurities, and slowly shaped it into something new. The second vessel was different from the first, but it was beautiful in its own way. Perhaps even more beautiful because it bore the marks of the potter's patient love. "But what does this mean for me?" the woman asked. "How does this help me with my broken heart?" Jeremiah reached down and picked up a small piece of clay from the riverbank. "This is what God showed me that day," he said, working the clay gently in his hands. "You are not ruined. You are not beyond hope. You are clay in the potter's hands, and he is still shaping you. The breaking you've experienced is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter." As he spoke, the clay in his hands began to take shape, becoming a small but perfectly formed vessel. "God's love is like this potter's skill," he continued. "It can take the most broken, damaged clay and create something beautiful from it. Your pain is not wasted. Your tears are not meaningless. They are part of the process by which God is making you into the person he always intended you to be." The woman began to weep, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of recognition, of a heart that was beginning to heal. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "How can you be so sure?" Jeremiah smiled, and in that smile was the peace of a man who had wrestled with God and found him faithful. "Because I have been clay in the potter's hands for 40 years, he said simply. "I have been broken and reshaped more times than I can count. I have questioned, doubted, even tried to run away from his calling. But through it all, I have learned one thing. The potter never gives up on his clay. He never throws it away. He keeps working, keeps shaping, keeps creating until the vessel is exactly what he envisioned it to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jeremiah continued to speak with the young woman and others who had gathered around them. He told them of the promises God had made, of a time when the exiles would return, when the city would be rebuilt, when God would make a new covenant with his people. He reminded them that their current suffering was not the end of the story, but part of a larger narrative of redemption and restoration. "The potter is still at work," he said as the evening drew to a close. "In your lives, in the life of our nation, in the great sweep of history itself, he's shaping something beautiful from the clay of human hearts and human history. Trust his hands, yield to his touch, and know that whatever he is creating in you and through you, it will be more wonderful than you can imagine. That night, as Jeremiah lay down to sleep, he thought once more of the potter's house and the lesson that had shaped his entire ministry. He had been privileged to be God's messenger, to speak his words to a generation that desperately needed to hear them. He had endured rejection, persecution and exile, but he had also experienced the incredible intimacy of walking with God through every trial. His life had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. He had been clay in the potter's hands, shaped and reshaped according to God's perfect will. And though he would not live to see the full fulfillment of the promises he had proclaimed, he knew with absolute certainty that the potter's work would continue. The hands that had shaped him would continue to shape others, generation after generation, until the final masterpiece was complete. The last words he wrote in his journal that night were these: "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him." And in the quiet darkness of a foreign land, far from the ruins of Jerusalem but close to the heart of God, Jeremiah slept peacefully, knowing that the potter's hands were still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The message he had carried for 4 decades would outlive him, would speak to countless generations of broken people who needed to know that they were not beyond hope, that the potter never gives up on his clay, and that his love truly is new every morning. The story of Jeremiah reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when our lives seem shattered beyond repair, we are never beyond the reach of the potter's hands. Like clay on the wheel, we may be broken, but we are never discarded. We are loved, shaped, and reshaped by hands that know exactly what we can become. And in the end, that is enough. That is everything. In the quietness of this story's end, may you find the peace that comes from knowing you too are clay in the potter's hands, being shaped with infinite love and patience into something beautiful beyond your wildest dreams. The potter is still at work, still shaping, still creating, and his love for you is new every morning.